build up what I say. Okay, so for the first prompt, you have to select 2 characters and examine the physical and or emotional burdens they carry and how it influences their behavior. So for my first person, I had Norman Bowker, and I talked more about how his burden affected him after the war. And so the main idea that stop.
Okay, let's go. We're good. Keep going.
The issue that he had the most was that was his grief of not saving Kiowa in the field. Mm-hmm. And even though it was like 20 years later that he wrote the letter to O'Brien, he still had that grief from Kiowa. And in the letter on page 155, it says that Bowker describes the problem of finding a meaningful use of his life after the war. And the way that Bowker kind of talks about how he why he can't find meaning in his life after the war was after Kiowa kind of drowned or died, whatever, in that field. He feels like that day he kind of went under with him. And
Nothing, go.
Good.
And he still hasn't gotten out of that. And so that affected him later on when he was at that YMCA camp, and he couldn't take his life anymore because he couldn't find meaning after the war, so he eventually killed himself. And that just showed that his burden was already bad enough to where he couldn't find meaning in his life, but he also couldn't find meaning in his life and felt that the only thing left was to end his life.
Yep.
I'm gonna build on that.
That was a lot of information.
Yep. Alright. Well, I talked about Jimmy Cross, about how he carried with him the pictures of Martha and the letters. I said physically he carried the pictures of Martha, but emotionally he carried a great sense of longing for his life back home, and the pictures kind of reminded him of the life back home. And because even though Martha wasn't Cross's girlfriend, he still carried the photos with him because it gave him a sense of hope and brought him back to the memories of his life outside of Vietnam. And even though Cross thought that carrying the photos of Martha was helping him get through the war, it was actually clearly distracting him and everything, especially because Lavender died, where on page 16 said he had loved Martha more than his men, and as a consequence Lavender was now dead, and this was something he would have to carry like a stone in his stomach for the rest of the war. So that just shows that what he thought was helping him, in the letters and the pictures, was actually destroying the whole platoon, because the leader was being distracted all the time, which was affecting his performance negatively.
Yeah, and I think that burden that he had with Martha carried into the burden that he ended up having throughout the whole entire war of Ted Lavender dying. Mm-hmm. So it kind of doubled up as even worse throughout the whole entire war, because like you said, it was that thing where it would carry it with him, a stone or whatever, through the whole entire war.
Yeah. And then he realizes that it is affecting him negatively, so he has to bury the letters and the picture.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing with Ted Lavender, he then ends up carrying grief or shame because he blamed himself for Ted Lavender's death because he was distracted thinking about Martha. That just shows how much of an effect her love had on him. Or his love had on her.
Do you think that'll be able to hear us?
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, and I agree. I kind of feel that generally all these people we've discussed so far, it all relates back to just the blame that they place on themselves for not being as responsible as they should have been for other people's deaths. That goes with Bowker when he lost Kiowa, and like you said, when Cross lost Lavender. But then, O'Brien's a little different because, well, at least what I said was how O'Brien carries the burden of the man he killed, and how he never felt like that was truly right, and yet it's still self-blame, but it's not necessarily based on the same kind of
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
different because
Yeah.
it's what he did versus what happened to his men.
exactly.
So someone else want to do their other person?
Alex?
Yeah, I also did Henry Dobbins. I said he carries the pantyhose of his girlfriend on ambushes while he's in bed at night. This reminds him of home and it comforts him, but it's also superstitious. It's the most important thing he carries. It represents hope and luck. On page 18, I'm pretty sure it's O'Brien narrating when he says, "They kept him safe. They gave access to a spiritual world where things were soft and intimate, a place where he might someday take his girlfriend to live." That quote shows that he has a hope of a future after the war with his girlfriend, and his superstition with the pantyhose caused him to carry them almost everywhere he goes, especially on ambushes, because he believes they protect him even though they truly have no protective power.
But the thing is that also, like, the pantyhose don't really symbolize his girlfriend, but just more life back at home.
Yeah.
Because even when you said that quote, like, it reminds him of the place that...
A place where he might someday take his girlfriend to live.
Yeah, the place, but not just exactly his girlfriend.
Yeah.
So he's talking about life after the war, just in general.
A soft and intimate place.
And that shows also when they break up, or when she dumps him and he still wears them. That just shows that it's kind of just like more just good luck.
That's because it's more of a superstitious thing.
It kind of almost seemed like how O'Brien wrote it, that like he didn't, not that he didn't care at all that they broke up, but like it wasn't as big of a deal as like you would think if he like carried it around with him all the time.
Yeah, and I think that idea of carrying things to remember home kind of relates to Cross as well, because he talks about Martha, but he also talks about being back at home with her, and how he doesn't want to be here anymore.
Yeah, I think the whole superstition thing is very prevalent with a lot of characters, because Jimmy Cross and the pebble from Martha serves roughly the same purpose as the pantyhose.
Yeah, those characters are similar in the things they carry.
Yeah. Okay. You have another person?
Well, I kind of went over O'Brien a little bit and how he carries the emotional burden of killing the man, and how that also is related to how he even years later when he's back at home, he still talks about how he sees the boy occasionally just when he's doing things, and he never truly figures it out, such as on page 134 when he talks about how he says, "Even now I haven't finished sorting it out. Sometimes I forgive myself and other times I don't." So even years later, while he's writing the stories like this, he still can't forget about those emotional burdens that he got in the war.
I got a question. Do you guys think that the physical things that they carry or the emotional things that they carry influence their behavior more? Like in the story? Emotional?
And I think the physical things also have an emotional attachment, which,
Yeah.
so those kind of relate, So.
They tied together.
Yep.
I think the physical things influence a lot of what they do while they're actually at war, because they carry so much physical stuff. Like, they talk about all the weapons and gear they carry, and then the emotional stuff more affects them afterwards when they're home.
Post-war.
Yeah.
And that kind of relates to the
But
cycle.
the emotional stuff does affect them a lot during the war too.
That is true.
Because obviously it affects them after the war, but like if it wasn't for like that emotional burdens, like Lavender wouldn't have died. There's, I guess, Kurt Lemon technically wouldn't have died, but mostly Lavender, because if Cross wasn't thinking about Martha and wanting to be back home the whole time, then he would have been watching out for Lavender and he wouldn't have gotten shot. So I think the emotional burdens were more there like before and after.
Yeah,
Or
just
during.
just like what Teague said, the physical stuff carries emotional weight too.
Anything else on this prompt?
Well, I did want to talk about how, it also kind of relates to when we talk about the emotional burdens and all that stuff. It changes people drastically, and even Bowker kind of talks about that. Like on page 156, he says, "It's almost like I got killed over in Nam. that night when... What?
Damn.
That's what it says.
It's
Nom.
nom.
You can say Nam too, I don't care. God.
Yeah, I had that quote too.
Yeah, that night
That's
when
what I was
Kiawa
referring
got...
to,
Yeah, you kind of paraphrased it. but-
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he says, that night when Kiawa got wasted, I sort of sank down into the sewage with him. So, you know, he talks about how that emotional burden permanently changed who he was. And I think in the story they don't talk about it too much, but there probably was also the way that they performed in the war after things like that kind of happened probably are affected by those emotional burdens as well.
I also have another question. Do you guys think that one of the major ideas they talked about were loss, grief, love, and hope? What do you think was the most powerful out of those four?
Grief.
Grief.
Grief, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
And
Well, because
shame.
it
I think-
it ties
because
into
grief,
shame.
Grief ties into shame, and I think shame is probably
One of the big
biggest.
ideas.
Yeah. I think that hope is up there with it though too, because every single one talks about what they hope, which makes sense. What they
Well,
hope.
because
will
I don't
happen
think
after the
you
war.
can, like, I think I said this later when it came to the story truth, like, I don't think they would have gotten through the war if they didn't have, like,
Yeah.
their hope.
Yeah.
Because what are they going to look forward to then?
Yeah, that's what keeps them going and
Yeah.
causes them to, you know, push through the war, and eventually what gets them back home.
Yeah. And the loss and the grief kind of tie together too, because the grief comes with the loss.
Do you guys
So-
think every character experiences loss to the same degree?
No.
Not to the same degree, but they do in
Like,
some manner.
We talked in class about how I don't know how to say his name,
Azar.
Azar, whatever. He basically always, like, put himself out there like he had no feelings at all, nothing
Yeah.
mattered to him. And then it was like when I can't ever say this guy's name right.
Kiowa?
Died. He even felt that, like, because I think we talked in class about it on, like, A-Day or something like that, where, like, why was that such a big deal? Like, Kiowa's death
Yeah.
to even someone that, like, doesn't care in
And
a
then-
way what happens.
Because
Yeah,
There's
like,
characters like him, and then there's characters like Cross who feel the emotional weight of like almost every character dying.
It might be their way of how they cope, though. So, like, maybe they are. It's just, like, the way he puts himself out seems like he doesn't care, but he also, like, internally could. It was just the way that O'Brien, like, told the whole entire story.
well, and also because Kiowa's death was so crazy because he was like the nicest guy in the platoon, and he
Yeah.
died in the worst way possible,
And
pretty much.
that was the ironic thing. Like, he was,
Yeah.
like, the nicest and, like, one of the best soldiers that they had, and then he died in a
and
sewage
and it
field.
kind of puts into perspective like how the war doesn't really even care about you. Like, it's gonna take you no matter if you're the nicest or
Yeah.
worst guy.
and I mean, that's kind of relating to the girl also. What was her name again? Who came
Marianne?
to... Yeah, Marianne. And how, you know, they talked about when she first arrived, she was like the most innocent, sweet person they'd ever met, but then she ended up being consumed by the war, which...
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked about this kind of in class about how Kiowa, like, the war sucks him in and doesn't let you go.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is not really on the front.
Yeah,
but
that's
I know, that's what I was going to say. Okay. Going to the next one with the story truth and
Yeah.
How the soldiers tell themselves, like, no, sorry, I said that wrong. How the soldiers basically tell, like,
stories. Yeah.
stories of the war through their, like, untrue stories.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I basically said, this is, like, kind of the overall, like, general thing, mostly, that I said at first. So, the war stories, they're kind of based off of true stories that happen in, like, real events, but even if it's not facts and not, like, truth, that doesn't really matter in the end, because it's, like, the feelings that we feel when they, like, say it is actually what matters.
Yeah, it's written to emphasize the point that they're trying to get across.
I
Yeah.
think O'Brien even says that if a story feels true, then it's true.
No, he said if the story feels true, then it's not true.
Because,
Like
like,
he also said things that didn't actually happen.
No, because that's
No,
why
he
he
did.
writes these,
I have, yeah,
That-
one of
that's
the
why-
that's why he
the
writes
stories,
the fake stories, because it's easier for
It has to be.
readers like us to relate to it, because we haven't actually, you know, it dealt with what he did.
I feel like I wrote that somewhere.
and then, I also talked about, like, the relative truth about the war. The relative truth about the war. I said that the stories that the soldiers tell themselves show how they really feel about the war, because it gives insight into what they're thinking. And the Vietnam War is seen very differently in the eyes of the soldiers and the people back home because of how they tell the stories. This is because the stories that the soldiers tell people who aren't in the war aren't always totally true. And on page 179, O'Brien explains the happening truth, which was that he was afraid to look at the dead bodies, and he was still left with faceless responsibility and faceless guilt. And he says that the story truth is that he knew what the dead Vietnamese guy looked like, and he could describe him in detail. And then he also explains how the stories make things present, which you guys already talked about. But the effect of this is that the story truth that the soldiers tell other people, like they think that the story truth is true. So it kind of the relative truth about the war just isn't always right because they're being told stories that aren't always factual.
Yeah, okay. You gonna go or what?
Yeah, I have a quote from the same spot as Cooper from page 180. That I just need help understanding, I guess.
Okay.
Because he says, "Daddy, tell the truth. Kathleen can say, did you ever kill anybody? And I can honestly say, of course not.
Yeah.
Or I can honestly say yes."
That
came up. I think that came up like multiple times throughout the book.
Well,
and I just don't really get it.
You said, yeah, honestly, yes. And I was like, what?
So
I tried to figure that out.
I think it relates to,
I mean, you think it's like
because
it's kind of connected to what
honestly,
he talked about.
well, it could be because he technically, because we learn obviously at the end that none of these stories, like most of these, or all of them, are fictional. So technically, he probably killed someone in the war.
Well, yeah.
But did he ever actually see it happen?
And no, he actually said that specifically in the story. He said how, because it makes it so much more emotional when he talks about in that, I forgot which chapter it was, but the one where he talks about, it's probably the man I killed, huh?
Yeah.
But where he goes in depth about the way the boy was lying and all that. But he said that in the happening truth, in real life, he didn't actually even see some of the people he killed. He didn't stop to look. They just kept going,
So he probably did actually kill people.
Yeah, but he didn't see it in that detail.
Oh,
he
but
just
he's saying
but
he's saying since he didn't actually.
He used that to emphasize it.
But
he
I
didn't
think
actually see
the story
people he
truth
killed.
is that he looked at him and he could describe in detail.
That's why
what
he
people
made
thought
up
when
those
they tell.
All the
like
details
when
of
he
the guy
said, what page is it, 130? Like the slim, dead, almost dainty young man of about 20, and how
That's
he
all
made
story.
up like this whole entire life for him, and it's like not even true.
Because he didn't even look at the guy.
It's like when we talked about in class. I think we talked about this too, but like putting a face to the boy.
Because it makes it also, I mean, it makes O'Brien feel like that, like he has like a connection. But it just
makes him.
But
it
also
feel worse.
Yeah, but like.
But I think it helps
he
him resolve
that.
things a little well too.
Yeah, because he says that.
Yeah, he says that.
He has faceless guilt.
Yep.
When that's the happening truth is he got faceless guilt, so he's trying to put a face on the guilt so he can kind of try to overcome it.
But,
exactly.
So I think that's like his soldier, like mind or whatever, doing that for him. Explaining, putting that image and life in his head. But I also think when it's like his writer perspective, it's for like readers like us to understand it too, because that's what I wrote for a lot of them, like how if he would have just said that he probably killed a man, and we would have just been okay. But when you put a whole entire story of how this guy would have been super good at math and he didn't want to follow his dad's footsteps and whatever, then we're oh dang, that sucks.
Yeah, he kind of overthinks it too, and I think that's what causes O'Brien problems in the first place, because he thinks too much into the life of the man he killed. But like I said, I mean, when he actually did that in the happening truth, that's not actually what he did. He did that in story truth to emphasize the point.
Yeah.
So in the happening truth, he just threw a grenade and killed someone.
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
Maybe. We don't know. I think that kind of still ties back to what you said at first when we were talking about this, was that how everyone has their own relative truth to it, because what is such a big deal to him for killing someone at war, another soldier that was with him could not matter at all. And so I think that, okay, where was I going with that?
Don't know.
Shoot.
It's alright.
Oh, because when it comes to every single person, that's what I was going. Okay, so when you think about what O'Brien, how he talked about the stories, like he said on page 85, when he talked about Kurt Lemon's death. It wasn't a war story, it was a love story. And how he talked about, I mean, we all know this, like, it was almost beautiful, you know, the sunlight, whatever. And then you go to people like Bowker, who, when he talks about the war, it's like just like sad. There's no like light in it. Like, it's just Kiowa dying. He feels like he was dying too. And that's just like, it's the relative, like, what they felt at war. Like, that's how they tell their stories. Like, if we're going back to the prompt, like, if, not that O'Brien looks back and was like, oh, the war was great. Like, it was, like, all beautiful and stuff like that. But, like, that's his way of coping with, like, looking back and,
Continue.
Looking back and, like, remembering, like, okay, I keep getting messed up. Remembering how the war was for him in a way that he doesn't look back on it and, like, just go into, like, a rut every single time he thinks about the war.
Yeah, it makes the memories better. So it's him dealing with the cycle of the memories coming back into his brain.
Yeah. But I think that the, like, mostly is just that he's trying to put a face on the guilt so he can try to get over it. I feel like that's the big part of it. Because, like, if he doesn't, then he's still with that faceless guilt. Yeah, he's trying to put a face to it and put stories to it so he can try to get over it and overcome it.
Yeah, because that's, I mean, for every person, like, that's his way to get over the death of that guy.
Anything else?
I had something else to say. Okay, so if we're going to Rat Kiley, so there was a part where he was telling the story about Marianne, and he would always stop and talk mid-story, and he was known to, like, exaggerate his stories and insist, like these are facts, like, I promise. And what I kind of came to was that it doesn't really matter what the facts were, what the facts were in that story, but, like, it matters. So the overall message of the story of Marianne is, like, your loss of innocence, but also, like, how fast the war can change you. And I think that the way Rat Kiley said that, it was kind of ironic because later in the war, like, he loses himself really fast, and the war changed him really fast to the point where he, like, grew cold inside and, like, lost any emotion, and eventually, like, just had to leave. I mean, it's obviously different because Marianne just walked away and he, like, shot himself in the foot. But I think it's... That guy said? It's...
Yeah, I'll
that guy.
I have a question.
go from there. Well, I was going to say something real quick. I just wanted to say that. And that kind of relates to, at least that was kind of what I said for
story truth.
To be one of the most important truths in the story, because, you know, in the prompt it says that it asks about what is the most important truth shared about the war, and I feel like the idea of the never-ending cycle.
Is that the third one?
Yes.
In your opinion?
Yeah, in your opinion. Yeah. But yeah, what I was saying was, I think it's one of the most important truths about the story is how, you know, it's a never-ending cycle of memories, and it causes people to change who they are, and nobody's ever really the same after they come out of the war.
Can I add something to what Ava said?
Sure.
So, for the second prompt, I said story truth is how O'Brien communicates the Vietnam experience. So do you think that whole story about Marianne is made up by O'Brien to communicate how the war changes people, or do you think it's made up by Rat Kiley?
Well, I think it was made up by O'Brien because Rat Kiley's not a real person.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you, like, because then we have to think about how all the stories in there are fictional. So, I mean, unless the character that's based off of Rat Kiley said that, and it was, like, all like falling in that. But I just think that, well, for what I said earlier, I think that he might have done that to foreshadow that Rat Kiley would lose himself really fast and, like, lose his innocence fast. So that's what I think, maybe.
Yeah. But I agree with what you said.
That makes sense.
I think that is his way of, just like we talked about earlier, how he writes the fake stories to get the point across. I think he wrote that story to show us how fast people change in the war.
Yeah, so then I think that's a really good example of story truth.
Because, it gets the point across, yet
It communicates,
not necessarily
a really big message about the book.
Anything else?
Okay, we have to go into the last one then.
What?
Because we only
What's the last one?
touched on that like for a second when Teague said it.
Wait, what is
It's
it?
in your opinion, what is the most important truth
Oh.
shared about the war? So what'd you say again?
I said that I thought the most important truth was the idea of like a never-ending cycle of memories and how that, you know, it changes the way people are and the personalities and the effect it has on them after the war.
Yeah, I just said like when we were talking about earlier too, the truth, like the facts don't matter. It's how they felt and like their memories of like how they felt with like what came with the war actually matters, because if you think back on it, he had said somewhere like that he doesn't remember all of like the exact details of like stories or whatever that happened. He just remembers how he felt in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think honestly that's like the only thing that matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
You guys have anything to say?
Nothing about that
You
really.
don't have an opinion?
No.
On what you thought what the most important truth was? No?
Alex, no.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Alright, we're
Good?
done.
I guess so.